to the Open Treasury podcast, your go-to source for the latest news and analysis in corporate cash and treasury management. This show is brought to you by CTMfile.com and the Treasury News Network, where Treasury professionals learn and share the information that matters most.
Hello and a warm welcome to the Open Treasury podcast from CTMfile. I am Pushpendra Mehta, Executive Writer for CTMfile, and I have with me Greg Jeffrey, Managing Partner and Strategic Treasurer. Welcome to the podcast, Greg.
Push, it's good to be talking about this leading practices series that you're writing. I'm quite enjoying it.
Thank you. For the benefit of our CTMfile audience, we will begin our conversation by discussing the 7th article in a series on leading practices in corporate treasury published on CTMfile. This article is centered around staff development and is divided into two parts. We have discussed the first part in an earlier podcast dated March 21st that I will encourage our CTM audience to listen to on ctmfile.com. Today we will be discussing the second part of staff development that focuses on 4 key components: commitment to teamwork, encouraging creativity, ongoing intellectual vigor and learning, and flexibility and adaptability. Craig, it is said that the more marketable the employees are, the more valuable they are to the treasury team and the corporation. My first question to you is about commitment to teamwork. They say no treasurer makes it alone. Treasury leaders know that exceptional treasury departments are created by teams, with teams, and through teams. In your opinion and your long experience, what are the key components of a team-centric environment?
Good question. I think we know when we have friends or people in our work environment who are reliable, people we can count on, we consider them dependable. They have our backs, they make commitments, they keep them even when it hurts. And if they aren't able to keep them, they'll have the hard conversations earlier so people are alerted as opposed to waiting till things get out of control. So I think commitment to teamwork has this trust factor and commitment factor, just like in any environment, whether it's a sports team, marching band in college, or any type of environment you can think of, there's an element of commitment there. The second part to that is having a team that complements one another. Everyone does not need to have the same mindset, the same exact skill set, but this idea of a diversity of experiences and thoughts. And sure, in Treasury, you're going to have technical experience, that there's going to be some overlap, but you don't need to hire someone who's a mental twin with you. You want some pushback, you want a set of different viewpoints because you're talking about different problems, different approaches, and when there's different perspectives, it may come from different companies and they've solved the problem using a variety of sources, or maybe experiences you've had in other disciplines or with hobbies or from what you've read allows you to bring that type of creativity or those ideas to the table to solve today's problem. So just like, our eyes are separated on our heads from a certain distance, so we have depth of vision. I think this diversity of experiences, thought, and thinking helps us quite well. The other commitment to teamwork, you might say this is not what you really asked, but I'm going to say it anyway, and you can comment on it. But this idea of, in Treasury, you need quite a bit of analytical rigor, logical thought to go through, whether it's addressing risk, exposures, or trying to come up with what scenarios might exist that threaten our organization. This is really critical, this analytical rigor. And I would say finally the commitment to teamwork is you're solving problems not in isolation. You might do some of the work in isolation, but you're coming together to make sure that the team has what it needs to meet the organization's goals, adequate liquidity over time. And so this commitment to teamwork covers everything from relationships to with banks to how you consult and advise the rest of the business to ensuring you have adequate liquidity in the short and medium term, your balance sheet works well. Those are some of the key commitments to teamwork and how those will play out, just as a starter.
Great. My next question to you is about, you mentioned the word creativity. Is how do you encourage creativity given the fact that we live in a world, particularly treasury, where the digitization and automation of treasury and the adoption of e-commerce and online models across industries and geographies is rampant. We need to live in a world where creativity will be accorded more importance. So, how can the treasurer foster creativity? To talk about it and to try and forge it is easy, but how do you make this pragmatically possible?
Push it. When I think about creativity, I don't know how other people think about it, but there's almost this view in large corporations that, oh, there's this group of people over here in marketing or some other area that are the creatives. And there's an aspect of that where that might be true, that there's certain creativity to pull things together, but creativity is, either creating things new or fresh or pulling in other ideas and putting them together in combinations that didn't exist. And that has to exist in, I think, every area of an organization, but it certainly has to exist in Treasury. So I think that the mindset is there are some people that are more creative at approaching problems and bringing other ideas into the mix to come up with a way to solve that problem. And we all need that. So I think the first way of encouraging creativity is to understand that there are different ways of being creative, and there's certain people that are more creative than others, and we need that in Treasury. I think that's one aspect. The second is what creates opportunities for creativity. Usually it's challenges. If you're doing the same thing every day, it's like you can still be challenged to, let's automate this. How can we most effectively automate this or bring in technology? How can we do it differently? Can we make it more efficient? Can we eliminate it? How can we do that? What's necessary? So it could be based on projects or challenges. That can be everything from what if we double in volume, from an operational perspective? What if our exposures are now 2x or 3x? And we will, every 2 or 3 years, if we don't do anything different, we will run afoul of our risk appetite, what we're willing to accept. How will we keep things in alignment with that? So however those projects and challenges are put forth, people need to think about what if, what could happen, what are the different concerns that could happen. So I guess across the board, there's ways to encourage creativity. If you ask those questions, how do you solve those? By thinking? How do you solve those? By using tools, whether it's business intelligence tools, technology, putting that in place. Could be, creating extra discipline with how we manage our teams, setting goals and standards. And that sounds anti-creative, but the idea of if we automate more, we're trying to free up time for higher level thought tasks, higher level creative tasks that help our organizations run better. And so those are a couple of the areas. The other, on the creativity side, you mentioned digitization and automation. How do we support that creativity? I think there's some of it has to fall into the human element, the communications side. How do we be creative? We learn more. And so that might be we read more, we look at disciplines outside our own. It could be about history or anything. But we also become students of the organization and understand what they're doing. Because when we understand that, we get other ideas on how to solve their problems. We understand the business better, the risks better, which usually gives us more options to choose from. I think those are the key things. Letting people think and not having them buried under, you've got 9.5, 10 hours worth of work you got to try to jam into your supposed 8-hour day. I think those are some of the foundational ways to make it work. But you can't have that time or that margin of time without putting more automation in place and without being brutal about gaining efficiencies across whatever area of Treasury you're talking about.
You made a very important point, I thought, when you said that you dispelled the notion that creativity is not really a part of content creation or marketing. It is something that can be seen in Treasury, in finance, in the analytical rigors, as well as anybody who has to do with automation or business intelligence. Moving forward, you also mentioned a very important term, students of the organization. My next question to you kind of ties up with the analytical vigor and the analytical rigor you mentioned. But in the article, you are quoted as saying, when it pertains to ongoing intellectual vigor and learning, that the best and the most strategic treasurers never lose their intellectual vigor and curiosity, no matter their levels of expertise or how much information or data they have in their gray matter. This is a very intriguing statement. And how can an organization or individuals within the Treasury team also adopt continual learning, curiosity that you touched upon, and vigor as a mechanism to become a better employee and therefore a better Treasury leader in the future?
A couple things on that. The comment about never losing their intellectual vigor or rigor and curiosity. I think that's important. Like the continual learner is something we hear about a lot. And I think, our brains are not bones. They don't become calcified in that sense. But there's this lack of flexibility we develop when we don't challenge our minds and continually think about things. What I've seen, the best treasurers are always learning and thinking about new things. They're challenging their people. They're moving things around. They're taking on new tasks, and they continue to grow. In a number of different areas. Any detailed technical aspect of Treasury, you can master it within a certain period of time if you have the intellectual capacity, the focus, and attention to detail. And so if you continue to do that, you're doing the same thing. You're not challenging yourself. Just like, when you exercise, and if you continue to do the same thing, you develop a certain mastery, but you're not challenging your bones, your muscles, your mind, your balance to do those things. So I think that's crucial. And part of that is, some of the things that we do that help us be organized. And I've seen this with some treasurers. They solve problems with different tools, different processes that they put in place, and they keep moving to other areas to clean up other areas. And sometimes maybe they've moved out of Treasury or they've moved out of finance, and so they don't have a time to go back. But sometimes they have this myopia. They're not going to look back at an area that they solved. In their mind, it's checked off. They've got the door closed. That door is not to be opened again unless there's some big issue. And so there might be some massive areas for efficiency that aren't done. And I've seen that before where someone solved, this issue and they've got, old style communication methods for pulling data in, but they won't look at it again because they're on to the next one. That was solved in their mind. And so they're continuing to work through a list. So I think that's part of it. Never being fully satisfied by areas. If you're always going to go back and keep retooling everything every 2 years, you're not going to get enough done. But that's one element. The other aspect of intellectual rigor, intellectual vigor, this continual learning is this, we need to learn in Treasury. We need to continually stay on top of what's in Treasury. But think of some of the interesting items that have come up over the last few years. It might be a combination of technology happening in other disciplines, that there's an impact in Treasury and finance, and we need to be thinking about that. There's learning in your overall business. There's this idea of how do I understand, like I think we spoke about learning and understanding the business. You have to go in and, don't want to say get your hands dirty, but you need to go to other areas of the company to see what they're doing, the other areas of the organization, to understand what makes them tick. Because how are you going to support them? How do you understand what the company needs to do? I won't mention the exact university, but there was a treasurer from a university, and you can see it in the book, but there's a treasurer from the university, also had some hospitals, right? Some teaching hospitals as part of their, portfolio of activities. In addition to regular higher ed, it was also medical. I remember him saying he went and visited different areas, including seeing surgeries, visiting places, sometimes like at midnight, to understand what's going on. And that helped him actually see what happened, which is never, well, to me, it's never how it's described. It's close, but it's different. It's almost like you're at two different events, what people describe as happening. And when you see it, you pick up all this additional richness, which informs your thinking quite heavily. But the credibility that he had by watching a surgery, hearing what goes on. Hey, someone came and saw what we were doing. The the grossness of a surgery, or they went and saw stuff and made intentional actions and steps to understand the business or the organization. I think those are some of the key elements. And so on a continual learning, it's about the business, but there's something else. Are you going to spend your time watching Netflix, watching the latest series and binge watch on whatever topic? Not saying you can't do any of that. Or are you going to, read or have conversations that stimulate your mind, whether it's treasury, finance, or other areas, other disciplines? Those are the things that I think they're much more fun mentally, and you can incorporate those into the business life. So those are some of the things that most of the best treasurers and CFOs have, this broader view. They bring in literature and history, and that enriches their conversation, helping people to understand. So those are the comments I would give you on that.
Those are very, very important points, I think. Can I ask you one question within the realm of intellectual vigor and learning? You touched upon working outside of the Treasury team or cross-functional learning being extremely important. Within that realm of cross-functional training, wanting to work outside departments, wanting to take interest in, conversations, history, books, where does upskilling feature into, if you had to tie in upskilling with intellectual vigor and learning? Where would that tie in? Would that be an important part for a Treasury executive or a Treasury leader?
Yeah, and I appreciate how you asked that, Push. I always think of upskilling as like maybe you got behind and you need to stay current on different tech, or you need to stay current with the speed at which tech is changing and how things come together and what you need to do to respond to that. This upskilling or this ongoing rigor of learning on a continual basis solves that issue, whether it was 30 years ago, 20 years ago, a month ago, or today. You have to be doing those things or you are obsoleting yourself. There's some things that are, strategic that aren't going to change as much. There's other very operational things that will change rapidly and extremely quickly. But nobody can avoid the change that's occurring. You can isolate how that impacts your day, but you can't isolate how it impacts your thinking and what you do. Whether you're a leader or whether you're a doer, you have to continue to upskill or up-tier your mind on a continual basis. This is not, let's do this every 6 years to bring myself current. It needs to be ongoing.
And you mentioned ongoing and upskilling, and I had another thought within this, which is that you and I have had a conversation about mentoring somewhere in the past. There's a very beautiful proverb that I read years ago which said a single conversation with a wise man is better than 10 years of study. I think it's a Chinese proverb. In that realm, what is the importance of, say, a Treasury leader or people in the team, within the Treasury team that have more experience? Can they have conversations? We live in a busy world, but can you have a weekly meeting or a weekly conversation or a monthly conversation where there is an exchange of ideas to facilitate this concept of intellectual vigor and learning? I'm sure it's happening, but is there a practice there that you would recommend to an organization which can help the more experienced people and the people with less experience have a conversation which helps in fomenting ideas and enhancing the collective brain power of the Treasury team?
Yeah, I think there's a couple key areas where this can happen, or key environments. One is people are put on projects to work together. There has to be collaboration, which involves discussing, deciding, negotiating how you're going to proceed, who's going to do what, batting different ideas about. There's one aspect of, this whole work from home environment of late where we're on Teams or Zoom or on screens. I know there's lots of discussion about that's been a boon for the introvert who does more internal processing as opposed to verbal processing. Sometimes it's harder, sometimes it's easier versus, in person, someone gets up to the whiteboard and sketching things out. I think there's some truth to both of those, but whether you're an internal processor or whether you're more of an extrovert and think out loud, process on a board and through your words, I think there's a couple elements there. One is that we're mindful that people think and engage differently, and that's in terms of how we understand them and also how we challenge ourselves. push the other part of how we have these experiences. Like I'll mention a couple things. We do webinars, which is primarily one-way communication. We're sharing information. We try to have a dialogue. The more we have a dialogue in front of somebody, the more interesting it is to the audience. We can see them engaging, typing. Same thing with podcasts, like where you're talking about an idea. Someone's doing something different. They're driving, riding their bike or whatever, and they're engaged in the topic. They're thinking about it. That's primarily cognitive and engaging that way. There's also other opportunities for, we might have roundtables to talk about forecasting or risk, or what are you thinking about economically with Russia's attack on Ukraine? How will that impact our supply chain? Whatever those elements are, this opportunity to share with a group that's not all from your organization. Sometimes that's someone's talking about something and their environment or their situation, their complexity is very different and it doesn't overlap well. It helps you think about something from multiple angles, just like an accident. You can see it from 4 street corners. You're going to have a much better picture image if you can gather all of that data. I think opportunities for those types of dialogues, and whether it's through some type of roundtable that's online, whether it's a Treasury association that's meeting in person or in a hybrid environment, those are other ways to foster these types of conversations and ways of sharpening each other, the additional sparks that occur outside your head rather than just thoughts that are coursing internally. So I think we can sharpen and develop each other that way.
Great. My last question to you for the day revolves around the fourth component of this article, flexibility and adaptability. So as you know, Craig, treasurers are living in difficult times and have to navigate global business through the Russia-Ukraine conflict, supply chain bottlenecks, volatile financial markets, and rising commodity prices and inflation. Amid the uncertain times, flexibility is considered a corporate virtue or an organizational jewel, perhaps. Is flexibility primarily about the ability to adapt to unexpected situations or new circumstances as they arise, and the alacrity to seize opportunities? Or is flexibility and adaptability this and much more?
I'm not sure how to exactly answer that question, but I think part of it is there is an ability to adapt, to respond to what's going on. There's also a preparation element that is crucial. How do you prepare yourself for something that you may not be able to forecast? That's not just meant to bend our minds, but how do you handle that? Well, just like if you're going to face physical challenges or whatever, you might say, oh, well, I want to have strength, agility, whatever. I want to train so I can better handle a variety of experiences, because maybe I'm not just going to be a tennis player or whatever the situation is. So there's a preparation side of things, and that has to do with our individual mental preparations, learning broadly, understanding what's going on. It also has to do with how we set up our technology. Can I get more responses from my data to answer questions that I don't know that I'll have? So you can list what I might be asked about, what I might need to know. But sometimes that comes up in the urgent of the situation. What's our exposure to Russian banks, to the cost of food, to the cost of fertilizer, to stainless steel because nickels become more expensive, or energy, whatever those elements are? There's an ability to prep and ability to respond. And so how do we organize our thinking? How do we organize our tools, our data, so that we can pull it up? And so we've talked about data lakes, business intelligence tools, and setting up other structures that allow us to answer more questions. That's worth exploring in some depth. Treasury needs to do that. And that can be different from, the historical approaches. I know what the questions are that I have. I figure out where the data is, and I make it so that I can respond quickly. Historical approach is often, I have the difficult question. I go in a very informal way, grab data, I plug it into a spreadsheet, and everything's off by 30 or 40%, so I'm really not confident with my answer in the end. So that's one part of it. We do have to understand that there are times of calm and times of disruption. I don't know if disruption interrupts the calm or if calm interrupts the disruption, But this idea of, hey, the new normal, the now normal, here's this this threat, this volatility. If you look back, I mean, through history, you got man's inhumanity to man, wars and famine and other issues. And we look over time, there's all kinds of dislocations and disruptions that occur, some much more significant and impactful than others. But we should not be surprised. We should be surprised if we have 5 years of calm or 10 years of calm without something significant. So we should be of the mindset that there's going to be volatility, that the normal is there's volatility punctuated by calm periods. So we should catch ourselves when we say no one could have expected X or Y, because that's a bit of a throwaway phrase. We might not know exactly how things come at us and in what combinations, but we know there's going to be significant disruption to cash flow, to volatility, to risk, to how we have to support our business, to relationships from the banking side, from a creditor side, to global markets, to our business mix. So this is just a beginning list of that. So I think that idea of I'm flexible, I'm adaptable, I'm nimble. I have to have a game plan. I have to be prepared to be adaptable. I need to have a team that has enough people who are quick at analyzing and responding. Not everyone has to do that in a team. That's part of the complementary side of things. But I think we don't think about flexibility and adaptability in quite the right way. The black swan, it's like, okay, this is great. Nobody expected that. But we have to understand that there's a lot of those events, something that happens 5% of the time, right? The ends of the curve. If you look at the curve and what goes on, you got, 2.5% on, 3 standard deviations on each side, a total of 5%. The second standard deviation, you've got other numbers. But even something that happens that falls outside this band 5% of the time, if that's over a half-year period, that's every 10 years you're going to have something that falls out there. That's significant. If it's every year, it's 20 years, several times in your career. But I think we find that the level of volatility is higher than we expect. And we make excuses by saying no one could have thought how these things came together in this particular way. No, maybe not in that particular way, but there's going to be volatility. So how do we prepare for things and how do we respond properly? That does have a key component of this commitment to teamwork and people that are intellectually rigorous and prepared. They can respond. And you see that militarily, teams that are only top-down control, they sit and freeze. You see that with sports teams to finance teams where people can make decisions within parameters and knowing how to work that will work best. So this broad topic of leading practices, staff development, I think it encompasses those items, which sometimes falls outside what we normally think of with staff development.
I'd like to ask you that one last question, which we've touched upon, but if you could delve into it in greater detail. Being prepared, extremely important. Asking the right questions, very important. In this, you mentioned the word volatile. We spoke about uncertain times. And we tie teamwork to creativity, to ongoing and continual learning, and ending with flexibility and adaptability. One of the things that kind of ties with all of this is the ability to anticipate. How important is, as a skill, negotiations is important, leadership is important. But in terms of staff development, how important is it to work on honing the skills of anticipation for members of a treasury team so that it improves decision making and performance?
There's an aspect of anticipation, which is really like, what are the models? What are the scenarios that could happen? I think one, it starts with mindset, and two, it's a planned activity. The mindset is, we like to break things down to an expected value, like this line right in the center of the bell-shaped curve. And the bell-shaped curve can be really long or it can be narrow and different, whatever the events are. What's the price of oil going to be? What's the influence of that price on my shipping, my products, my labor force, whatever? We think, okay, here's a model of here's the range. And so we think of, hey, now this is the expected number, or we have it really tightly defined. The expected value is probably, for a risk manager, for someone in Treasury, that's probably one of the least helpful mindsets, because we fall into complacency. Now we have a single forecast based on this assumption. Well, nothing falls into that. Maybe it's close to that, but this idea of risk is diverse and spreads out across this either wide or narrow distribution curve is probably more helpful. We need to think in terms of things of ranges. We need to think of interrelationships. How does this impact something else? Is it going to be material or is it going to be minor? If you're paying whatever, you're paying 100, whatever the units are, for energy, and the price variability could be double, right? It never has been more than 10% in any month. But all of that is less than 1% of your income. You're not going to be impacted that much. Yeah, okay, it went 200%, but it wasn't consequential. Well, if that 100 is 20% of your income or your disposable income, that movement hurts dramatically. And so there's a level of anticipating and understanding or calibrating our ability or our organization's ability to handle that risk or that volatility, and then force ranking those or ranking those so that you're addressing maybe the less frequent, high impact items. Because I think we're pretty well accustomed to identifying the high frequency, moderate impact, high frequency, high impact, because we're always thinking about those because we see it. But when it's high impact and very infrequently, we don't plan for it as well. And there's lots of issues and examples of that, both in Treasury, governmental planning. Almost every discipline has those as examples. Like we didn't anticipate that much of a change.
That made for a thought-provoking analysis, Craig. Very big thank you to you and to our CTM audience for joining us on this edition of Open Treasury. Please subscribe and look in the show notes for the article links. Thank you.
This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.